Hi Jennifer, how are you doing?
Hello, hello.
Just as a bit of a preview for the folks, what can we be expecting from today's talk from you?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'm excited to be here. This is the Reedsy webinar on writing exciting and readable nonfiction. So we're going to cover just some basics on writing and revising. We're going to discuss what makes a book readable, what distracts from readability, and I've included some hacks and some of my favorite tips that I give to my authors when I'm working with them on nonfiction. So welcome everyone to this Reedsy webinar. My name is Jennifer Hartmann, and I am an associate project editor at Hachette Book Group in Boulder, where it's currently 1 p.m. and I think we're getting a bit of snow tonight. My background in editorial, I began working in academic publishing. I'm currently working at a Big Five trade publisher, but I started my editorial career in the acquisitions department at an academic publisher, and I've always worked mainly in the fields of psychology, sociology, some anthropology, and health and wellness, which is really trendy right now. That is a booming topic. If you've Googled information about writing nonfiction before, you've probably found a lot online because there is a lot online. But today I wanted to focus specifically on making nonfiction work readable and accessible. And on this first slide, I wanted to, second slide, briefly go over what nonfiction is, because there are lots of subgenres within nonfiction that you perhaps might not be as familiar with. Martin did mention memoirs. We do include memoirs in nonfiction. Memoir and autobiographies and biographies are just stories that are true and that are told well. And they are very, very popular. But historically, nonfiction has not been as popular. We've kind of associated nonfiction writing with boring textbooks and encyclopedias. But nonfiction is becoming very popular. While it used to be published just by small presses and academic presses, Big Five publishers like Hachette and HarperCollins and Penguin Random House are very actively and enthusiastically seeking out nonfiction as much as they are literary fiction and poetry.
I'm struggling a bit with the slide right now.
Oh, that's okay.
I'm going to try and get it back up for you.
I
may have to do something quite inventive.
We can do this. But I wanted to give a couple examples of some very successful nonfiction work. The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. This is an example of creative nonfiction. It's a great piece that was turned into a movie. The following slide is maybe not, maybe I switched these up. Columbine, you can barely read that, I'm sorry, that book title. It's a gorgeous cover, but a little difficult to read. This is a nonfiction book by Dave Cullen, and the content alone is riveting because so many people are curious to pick up a book about tragic incidents so that we can learn from them, so that we can increase our awareness. So books that teach about something that's happened in our society are very popular. It does require extensive research, but the audience always benefits greatly from this labor. Also, the next slide is another example of fantastic narrative history. This book, I believe, was a runner-up for a National Book Award a couple years ago, and for very good reason. Ibram Kendi did tons of research on this. This is a journey through comprehensive history of anti-racist ideas. And like Columbine, books like this start a collective social dialogue, and they're just becoming more popular because of the speed and the ease with which we can communicate in today's modern world. I'll breeze through these next ones. The next slide is an example of an instructional. Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird. If you're working on a book right now, you may have this on your shelf. If you don't, this is a fantastic book to pick up. Do you want to learn how to write better? This book does exactly what it says it will do. It teaches you to become a better writer. And Anne Lamott is funny and witty and very knowledgeable. The next one is a memoir. This is called Shrill by Lindy West. This just came out within the last year or so. And my goodness, she is a riot. Authors who are funny, I mean, these books really sell well. This is nonfiction at its most hysterical because she's a natural comedian. So this is something to keep in mind, and I'll touch on this a bit later, but humor can be a great tool to have in your nonfiction arsenal, because once a reader picks up a book, if they're laughing so hard, they won't be able to put it back down. And the final example that I included here is another self-help book or self-empowerment book, and these are extremely popular today. This genre is arguably the biggest up-and-coming, or rather has already arrived, subgenre within nonfiction. If you go to a Barnes & Noble, you will find self-help books on the front shelves being marketed and advertised because they are selling. Jen Sincero is also a very funny writer. So let's move on to the next slide and the topic of readability, because that is what this presentation, this webinar is about. But what is readability? I included a little definition there, and I'm focusing on the second one more so than the first one, but the quality of being easy or enjoyable to read. And that's what a readable book is. A reader should be able to pick it up and easily read it and enjoy it. So besides a noun, readability, maybe let's talk first about what readability isn't. If you think back to some college textbooks that you read, are we doing okay, Martin? Okay.
Sorry there, I was just, I'm just sort of focusing on you while I try to resolve something.
Okay, sure, no problem, no problem. I can talk about readability for quite a while. So readability is important. What readability is not, if you, again, think back to maybe some school textbooks that you read in middle school and high school that your teachers forced you to read, and maybe you were just struggling to stay awake while reading them, or maybe they had errors in them that distracted you. On this note, authors who self-publish do benefit greatly by hiring multiple editors, because we will help you to clean up the writing and make it readable. But one thing that really hampers readability is typographical errors and a lack of style. If that next slide is available, I've included 4 tips, and we'll just move through these pretty briefly. But the first one is to just learn the basics of writing. It's very vital for authors to have at least a working knowledge of grammar and of style. By far, the most common problem I encounter with new or less experienced authors is they're not fully aware of these basics. It's very true that an editor's job is to help you clean up your writing, but the editor's work is cut out for them if there are clunky sentences and typos and scattered errors. And these really are things that are quite preventable. So you can teach yourself a lot of these basics and save yourself some time and some money by reducing the amount of errors in your work. Thankfully, an incredible style guide has been on the market for, I believe, nearly a century now. I believe it was published in 1920, but this is The Elements of Style by William Strunk Jr. and E.B. White. It has absolutely stood the test of time, and it's really the bread and butter of writing manuals. It covers the basics, but it also gives you a lot of cool style tips that will make your book more readable. And I have this beautiful illustrated version that's it's got just a little extra fun in it because of the photos. And this is, of all the books I would recommend picking up, Elements of Style is number 1. It's a very important book to have. We can move on to the next slide, tip number 2, kind of a funny one, but a true one. You never want to frustrate your reader. Of course, typos and errors are frustrating, but these are not the only things that hinder readability. As you're writing, or as you're editing, or as you're revising, think about some of these questions. What are some things that bother you when you're reading a book? Again, think back to when you were a kid reading a text for school, or perhaps think about a time when you started a book and you just couldn't bring yourself to finish it. What happened? What went wrong? These are absolutely things you can think about when writing and revising your own nonfiction. On the next slide, I've included a few specific things that cause frustration. They may frustrate you. They definitely frustrate a lot of my peers who like to comment on books that they've read recently. The first is long sentences. And not all long sentences are bad, but they can frustrate and exhaust your reader. It can be energy sapping to read sentence after sentence if it's filled with commas and there's just too much going on, or perhaps you're trying to make multiple points and you're squeezing in too much that you could cover in a different sentence, or you could break them up into smaller sentences. And just reading and saying that sentence aloud is making me winded. So we don't want to do that to readers. It's not a readable way. It's not a readable thing in a book, having really, really long sentences. And short sentences are extremely effective. Changing up sentence length will help you control the pace of your writing. And short sentences are also great for changing the topic or introducing an element of surprise. Block text is another thing that can be exhausting for your reader. It can be overwhelming. So we want to break up big block text into smaller sections. And I do say this to a lot of my authors on the front end, but a lot of them are really surprised that we can still take big paragraphs and cut them into smaller paragraphs and smaller paragraphs. And there's no such thing as a paragraph that's too small. A single sentence can serve as a paragraph, and it can help you transition into different paragraphs. So it really does help you to transition and more smoothly communicate your ideas. On the next slide, my favorite, my favorite thing that frustrates the reader, jargon. And these are words or expressions used by professionals, usually within academic publishing, that's difficult for people to understand. And nothing frustrates readers like not being able to understand what you're saying. And jargon does one of two things. It either intimidates your reader, the poor things, or it makes them question you, and both are to be avoided. The reason is sometimes we use jargon and long words and long sentences because we aren't entirely confident about what it is we're saying. And this is normal. This is a totally human thing that we want other people, people that we know, people we don't know, people we will probably never know, to think we're great and to think that we're awesome and competent. But we use jargon to convince people that we're qualified to say the things we're saying, and it's not needed. You are qualified, you have something to say, just eliminate the jargon. On the next slide, I have, I think I included the entire conversation. This is my favorite media example of some egregious law jargon. If we have any lawyers or law students out there, my partner is studying law, so of course I have to poke a bit of fun at it for his sake. But this is the scene where the professor is asking Elle Woods to answer a question, and she gives a very straightforward answer to the question. She says, "You need evidence." And the professor follows up and asks her to expound on it. And she basically says the same thing with a dozen words when that one word sufficed quite well, which I thought as a kid watching this movie, oh no, the first part was better. And I don't know the ins and outs of law jargon. This was maybe necessary. I actually don't. I've never heard anyone say evidentiary support in day-to-day conversation, but perhaps lawyers do. But the point is, if you want to write well, don't talk like a law student unless you're writing a text for law students. Now that that horse has been fed, let's move on to the next subject, which is a little more subjective, but no less important, I think. And this tip number 3 is to be fearless. This is a brief pep talk because we all need one sometimes, but be fearless when you write, and especially when you revise your writing. And I say this because it can be really scary to write something down and then give it to someone else for them to read and critique. It's essentially like giving yourself to be edited. They're editing a piece of you, and that is scary. I've never worked with an author who was fully confident that all of their material was perfect. And most of them are very nervous about turning over their manuscripts because their writing isn't fully polished yet, and it can be better. Of course, I'm not saying to ignore grammar or elements of style, but also recognize that very few authors crank out a polished, best-selling novel on their first try. It just doesn't happen. So while it's likely that you won't ever feel your writing is as perfect as it can be, the good news is that you have as many chances as you want and need to revise it and to make it better. And that's because writing is not a one-time performance. It's a long and winding road. And on this note, a book that I love to pass on to my authors who do just maybe need that little confidence boost is Brenda Euland's book, If You Want to Write. And I cannot tell you how many people I've passed this specific book on to. It is marked up and eared and flagged, and it's one of those books that has so much in it, not just a pep talk, but things like tapping into your imagination, not being discouraged, finding your writing voice. And Brenda Euland is just a master at communicating. Simply reading her writing is its own lesson in writing. So after Elements of Style, this is a book that I would highly recommend that you pick up. And the next slide is my last major tip. Tip number 4, to consider humor. William Zinsser says, humor is the secret weapon of the nonfiction writer, and I absolutely agree with that. If you start on your revision process and maybe you've cut jargon and you've cleaned up sentences and you still find that your book is missing something, consider humor. It's intrinsically entertaining, and very few readers dislike being entertained. And it's especially great because you don't have to be a comedian to add humor to your writing. In fact, I know lots of authors who don't think of themselves as funny at all, and they're often the same ones who write incredibly witty and entertaining prose. It's true that some writers just have it, and it's just easier for them. It just comes more naturally, and perhaps stand-up could be a lucrative side hustle for them. That's not all of us, but it's something to consider. It really is, it can be a secret weapon. And William Zinsser's book on writing well, this also has lots of fantastic information on basics like word choice and sentence structure. But these abstract qualities like humor are, again, tools that you can add to that arsenal. And on my next slide, I wanted to include a few of these quick hacks because as an editor, I'm asked very frequently, what are some things, just give me a couple tools that I can use now, that I can use today, that will help me make the writing process easier. Whether or not you've started writing, you've finished a book, you are barely thinking about starting a book, all of these things can benefit you, all of these quick hacks. And the first one is to read your book out loud. Reading out loud is, it's an amazing, amazing thing to do. You catch more errors and you're just better able to locate sentences that drag out, maybe words that don't sound as good or that don't serve you. And it helps you to step away from your writing and kind of look at it in a different way. As an author, you may have experienced this agonizing thing where maybe you sit and you stare at a page for hours and you can't find out what needs to change, or you can't pinpoint those areas that just need a little bit of extra work. And reading out loud breaks your routine, which is sometimes all you need to get out of that rut. Of course, using a beta reader, I didn't mention this earlier, but this is a good thing to do too. A beta reader like a friend or a family member or a colleague, they can give you a new perspective as well if you don't feel ready to hire on a professional editor. Point number 2, use index cards. I love this one. Anne Lamott does this, and so if Anne Lamott does it, then of course we should all do it. When you experience something and words pop into your head and you think that thought of, oh, I'll remember this later, only to get home and have completely forgotten it, that's also agonizing. And sometimes the harder you try to recreate that image or conjure those words, the more impossible it seems. So don't lose that moment. Carry index cards with you, or a notebook or pieces of paper. I used to have scrap paper around with me sometimes, and I would just write on everything and put it all in the same little pocket of my purse and then dig them out and try and see if I could read them. But index cards are a good thing to have. Lastly, if you can, and this isn't something that we can all do, but if you can, turn off the internet. We get distracted easily. I don't know if it's just me, it's probably not. Lots of authors and editors and just people in general get distracted. We live in a world where information is coming at us quickly, and sometimes it's best to just turn it all off and focus on your writing. I understand this is difficult to do. A lot of us have kids, we have family, but if you can step aside and take an hour or two for yourself on a weekly basis for some uninterrupted focus time, it's extremely beneficial. So those are my quick hacks. And then on my very last slide, to end with a brief pep talk, just keep writing, because it really is a practice, and you do become better at writing by practicing writing. It's a learned skill, and it's one that you can always improve.
Thank you so much for joining us, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on. Bye. Thank you.